something if they prefer one, which I do considerably less. I want to focus particularly on New Orleans and outline. I think we're all pretty familiar with what the recent news has developed. I'll go through briefly the investigation that the Commission conducted and caused to be conducted in New Orleans, and tie it up as much as possible with the stuff that's coming out in the newspapers now as a result of Mr. Garrison's investigation. By way of introduction, when the staff of the Commission was chosen, the work of the staff was divided into 7 general areas. One of them, if I can remember them, go through all of them briefly. One of them related to the actual physical events of the assassination itself, what actually happened that day. That basically concerned firearms, identification, trajectories, and the placement and timing of the shots, that kind of thing. Another group dealt with the problem of the identity of the assassin. That's 2 or 6, I think, or 7. One of them dealt with the area of presidential protection. Another dealt with the possible involvement of Jack Ruby in the conspiracy. Another one dealt with Lee Harvey Oswald's activities outside of the United States, which comprised, which consisted of primarily his trip to the Soviet Union and his trip to Mexico in the fall of 1963. And the other area in which most of the conspiracy, aside from Ruby and the possible involvement of the possible connection of conspirators with Oswald's out-of-the-country activities, was comprehended under a very broad area in which I worked, and that dealt with all of Oswald's contacts and activities since from the time he was born until the time of the assassination. That included, there were 2 of us that worked in that area. Mr. Jenner, who's a lawyer in Chicago, who's made some remarks since the assassination, since the report was issued, which are mentioned in Mr. Lane, in the postscript to Mr. Lane's book, and some other areas, some of which are not based on fact, unfortunately. I think this results largely from forgetfulness or misinformation on Mr. Jenner's part and myself. We took testimony, and when we started work, we went through all of the FBI reports and other intelligence reports, but primarily FBI reports that related to anything in Oswald's background, relating to either possible personal motive or the possibility of a conspiracy as contacts with anyone else. We took testimony, and we requested additional investigation by the FBI in these areas, and we took testimony in 3 different places: New Orleans, in Dallas, and in New York. We took testimony in New York because we did take testimony of the leaders of the Communist Party, the Fairfield Committee, and the Socialist Labor Party. I think Oswald had correspondence with all 3 of the different organizations when we took the testimony of these people in New York. When we took a look at the New Orleans situation, we found what I did, and this is something that I did myself. So with all due respect to Mr. Jenner, he was an older lawyer. He was running for president of the American Bar Association at that time, and he was more concerned about writing letters to his lawyer friends across the country promoting his candidacy for the American Bar Association. He wasn't going through all these FBI reports, which were huge stacks of them. The way that I dealt with it, and most of the other lawyers that went through this did this too. In going through the reports, we dictated index cards. And I have a batch of them in my hand here, most of which relate to David Ferry, that came out of my own personal files. I kept all the index cards that I prepared during this time. And when this thing broke in New Orleans, I went back and reviewed them and pulled these cards to bring them over here. These mostly relate to Ferry. There's a couple at the end that don't. And this went into an alphabetical file by name. And there was a topical index that we worked in too, on different topics associated during particular periods, and that was cross-referenced to the name index. The FBI reports were put together, were all given commission document numbers. This one here refers to Commission Document 75, for example, which was a voluminous FBI report about that thick. It was a composite, put together a whole bunch of different individual agents' reports that were put together and related primarily to the activities that Oswald was engaged in New Orleans. The upper right corner, we put the commission document number, Ferry's name, and then the page number, and a brief summary of what the FBI report said about Ferry. And then, as things started, as it turned out, as we were able to piece things together, of course, we went back and to the original reports and decided on the basis of both these index cards and the original reports what witnesses we would actually take testimony from ourselves. We did not take Mr. Ferry's testimony. He didn't testify before the commission, and I didn't, neither Mr. Jenner nor I examined him in New Orleans. The reason we didn't, and that decision, for better or for worse at this point, was primarily my own. These decisions at this point were made at the staff level. They obviously would have to. You've got a whole mass FBI reports. The commissioners were not sitting down there until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning going through these FBI reports. So the initial determination of what witnesses were going to be called was made on the staff level. There were some particular witnesses the commission desired to call for various reasons, and they, of course, indicated that to the commission. Those witnesses were called. But as far as the exclusion of someone like Ferry, that was made on the staff level, and it was basically my decision. And the reason I decided not to call him was because the FBI had conducted what I regard as a very thorough investigation into what he had done at the time of the assassination, where he'd been, and looked into the possibility that he had known Oswald or had been connected with the assassination in any other way. And on the basis of the FBI reports, it seemed to me that he didn't have anything to do with it. So he became his name joined one of thousands of other names that appeared in the FBI reports, whose testimony was not taken by the commission. I think at the time, if I had to make the judgment over again, I would probably make the same judgment without the benefit of hindsight. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight and what's developed in the world, it would have been nice if we had taken his testimony. But unfortunately, or fortunately, the case may be, a lawyer, when a lawyer is involved in a situation of making a decision, he doesn't have the benefit of hindsight. Ferry is one of the Garrison has characterized him as one of history's most important men. And this is now Mr. Shaw, of course, as you know, has been both indicted, I guess, and found over as a result of a preliminary hearing for trial on a charge of conspiring with Ferry, and Oswald to assassinate the president. Another character who was involved in this was a lawyer by the name of Dean Andrews. And we did take Mr. Andrews' testimony because the FBI reports indicated that he may actually have had some contact with Oswald. It was quite clear from the FBI reports that Ferry did not. But Andrews, he could have. I don't know to this day in my own mind whether he did. The commission concluded that it couldn't develop any substantial evidence that he did. And it may have actually concluded that he had not seen Oswald. That Oswald had never been in his office. The claim was that Oswald had been in his office 2 or 3 times in connection with some personal legal matters relating to his own discharge from the Marine Corps, his wife's immigration status, and his own citizenship status. Andrews testified. It was kind of interesting. Andrews came over a couple times. I was in New Orleans, I think, 3 times. The first 2 times I was there, the second time Andrews came over, we would ask the Secret Service to give these people notice that we wanted to take their testimony. And either the first time Andrews came over, I had to go to Dallas or something, or he came late. I wasn't able to take his testimony. The second time I wanted to come over, he wouldn't come. So we had to subpoena him. He came under subpoena. And we also, in the subpoena, we asked him to bring with him any records that he might find in his office to indicate whether or not Oswald had ever been in his office. Well, Andrews came over, and I took his testimony. I don't know how many of you saw Mort Saul the other night, and it was a week ago, Friday. It was kind of an amusing thing from my point of view, because Mr. Saul read Mr. Andrews. He had 2 guys, Mr. Saul and one of his producers, and they read Andrews' testimony. And Mr. Saul played my part, reading my lines, and his producer read Mr. Andrews' lines. And I was somewhat amused to see Mr. Saul taking the part of his friend Wesley J. Liebeler. But in any event, Andrews testified, as I indicated, that Oswald had been in his office 2 or 3 times, and that there had been some people with him, different people, I think different people all the time, except there was one Mexican-looking fellow that Andrews described as wearing a silk pongee shirt that was with him a couple of different times. The people that seemed to be that were with Oswald seemed to be homosexual. And this tied up with other rumors that had developed in the French Quarter that people who inhabited the quarter in the homosexual community had seen Oswald in the quarter with an assorted group of homosexuals. The FBI made a pretty thorough investigation of the quarter trying to trace this down. They weren't able to establish that, in fact, Oswald had ever been there. And there wasn't any other independent evidence that Oswald had any homosexual proclivities. And Marina Oswald testified that he stayed pretty close to home during this period of time. At least he wasn't out of the apartment overnight. And the testimony now is that he was apparently at one point living with Ferry, which is not consistent with what Marina said. But that, again, involved a judgment, of course, as to the credibility of Marina Oswald. And my own view on that has been that I think her testimony is not entitled to very much weight unless it can be corroborated by independent evidence that tends to corroborate it. And there is no other evidence on this question besides Marina's testimony. So I would be inclined not to give very much weight. Andrews, the interesting part of Andrews' story, now, we asked Andrews, Oswald wanted Andrews to go back and see if he could clear up his discharge. He had received a bad conduct discharge from the Marine Corps. And Andrews said, well, Andrews is a very interesting fellow. He talks in sort of a modified French Quarter jive talk. And I must say, some of his lines were really very amusing. He threw me at one point by referring to something called the Phoebes. And I was not alert enough to understand what the Phoebes were at first glance, but he said, you know, the Phoebes, the FBI. And, but it was possible to understand him. But his testimony was, he said that someone had broken into his office and sort of ruffled through his papers, and he couldn't find any papers that related to, that showed that Oswald had been there. His secretary, the FBI questioned his secretary, she had no recollection of Oswald ever having been there. And his private investigator had a vague recollection that he might have been, but he really couldn't, he was very unspecific about it. The most interesting thing about Andrew's testimony, though, was his statement that on the day of the, it was either the 22nd or the 23rd, I believe it was the 23rd, he was in the hospital at that time with pneumonia. He was under fairly heavy sedation, he said, and sometime in the afternoon, he was unclear as to the exact time, he received a telephone call from someone, from a voice that he recognized as Clay Bertrand. And this voice asked him, Andrews, if he, Andrews, would represent Oswald in Dallas in connection with the charges that were going to be, that already had been brought against him at that point. I think he'd only been charged with shooting on certificate. Andrews then said that he called another lawyer in New Orleans by the name of Monk Zeldin, Z-E-L-D-E-N, and asked Zeldin if he would represent Oswald since he, Andrews, was sick, couldn't do it. Zeldin told Andrews at that point that he didn't have to worry about it. Andrews didn't have to worry about it because Oswald had been shot. This was Sunday when Andrews called Zeldin. And so the matter was dropped at that point. When Mr. Garrison's investigation broke, I went back and reviewed what the report had said about this. And Andrews' testimony was unbelievable, standing by itself, in terms of either his ability to identify Clay Bertrand, and it was unconvincing that Oswald had ever been in his office, and it was unconvincing and unclear as to whether he'd ever received this telephone call or not, because for various different reasons, one of which was the time problem. He first testified that his private investigator was there at the hospital when he got the telephone call. But his private investigator didn't remember the telephone call coming into the hospital while he was there. But the investigator was there till sometime, I think, after 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. And Andrews testified that after he got the call, he called his secretary about it. His secretary said that Andrews hadn't called him about it, as I recall. He hadn't called him at all until, if he had called him, it was prior to 4 o'clock, prior to the time that Andrews said he got the call from Bertrand, which was supposed to be verified by the presence of the detective who didn't remember the call. The secretary didn't remember the call. And the report so indicates. One of the things, of course, when I sat back and thought about this again after the Garrison thing broke, because I wondered, and the report didn't say anything about what Mr. Zeldin said about this. And we didn't take Mr. Zeldin's testimony, but I went back through my files and I found an FBI report of an interview with Mr. Zeldin, in which the bureau asked him about this. And Zeldin said that Andrews had called him about this. And that is not reflected in the report. And that's one of those things that one can observe after the fact and say, well, he made a mistake. And it's clear that I did in that context, because we should have questioned Andrews about Zeldin about it, and we certainly should have reflected in the report that Andrews that Zeldin had said that Andrews had called him. I have no idea what the relationship between Zeldin and Andrews is. Zeldin is acting as Andrews' attorney at this point. Andrews, at this point, has been indicted for perjury by the grand jury. Apparently, I'm told, now I haven't seen this in the paper, but I'm told that the indictment doesn't relate to any of his testimony involving Oswald, but it in fact relates to questions that Garrison asked Andrews as to whether or not Andrews had been going around posting bail or putting up bail. Andrews represents a whole slug of these homosexuals, but apparently they run off the streets of the French Quarter every Friday night. Probably make room for the tourists, I don't know, but he goes out and he bails these people out. And he said that many times Bertrand used to call him and ask him to go and bail these different homosexuals out. Andrews, subsequent to all this, to his testimony, and subsequent to the time the report came out, became an assistant district attorney of Orleans Parish, of Jefferson Parish, which is next to Orleans Parish. And it's illegal for an assistant district attorney to go out and post bond for these people that are picked up by the police for, I suppose, fairly obvious reasons. And I'm told that Garrison asked Andrews if he had been going around putting up bail for the homosexuals after he became an assistant district attorney. Andrews said no. In fact, he had. And so the perjury count apparently relates to this testimony. Now, I had at first thought, and the impression was given in the newspapers, that the reason that Andrews was indicted for perjury is because he declined to identify Clay Shaw as Clay Bertrand, which he did do. He said that he couldn't say that Shaw was Bertrand, and he couldn't say that Shaw wasn't Bertrand. Which goes back again to the fact that when I asked him about this, well, first of all, the FBI kept after him. The FBI was looking for Clay Bertrand throughout this entire period after the assassination. They were looking for him throughout New Orleans. The Secret Service was too. And they went through did all the things that the FBI usually does, trying to locate somebody. They weren't able to find anybody by the name of Clay Bertrand. And of course, they kept pestering Andrews about it. They'd come back every week and have you seen the guy? You know any more about it? Can you help us anymore? And so the final FBI report on their questioning of Andrews said, well, Andrews finally concluded that he'd made the whole thing up. He was under sedation, and it was a figment of his imagination. Well, when I took Andrews' testimony, he said, that's what I told the Phoebes, because you know how it is. He said, when they're after you, he said, they're like cancer. They're after you all the time. They finally told him to put down anything in the report that they wanted to, just stop bothering about it. But then he testified that subsequent to his last interview by the FBI, and prior to the time that I took his testimony, which was in the third week of July 1964, that he had seen Clay Bertrand in the street, in a bar. And when he walked into the bar and saw Bertrand, he immediately went over to call the Secret Service to get them to come down and pick this guy up. And Bertrand saw him and ran out and got away. This was the only time that Andrews had seen Bertrand. Subsequent to the telephone call, and the only time that he'd seen him prior to that was not really clear when, as much as a year or two prior to that time. He said primarily he knew Bertrand as a voice, but he had seen him before, and he was able to recognize him when he saw him in this bar. Told the FBI that Bertrand was about 6 feet 1 inches tall and had, I don't know, he mentioned his color, the color of his hair. He told me that the guy he saw in the bar was 5'8", and he had a different color hair. It was a completely different description. And I asked him if he could explain the apparent discrepancy between what he told the FBI about Bertrand's physical characteristics and what he told me. And his answer was somewhat typically that of Dean Andrews. He said, "Look," he says, "I don't play Boy Scout and measure them." And I always had this picture of Dean Andrews standing there with one of these rods, making a triangulation of these people so he could tell us how tall they were. But now he's not able to testify one way or the other as to whether Shaw is Bertrand. The way that whole sequence obviously would be a significant if it could be pursued and legitimately developed. We weren't able to do it. The FBI wasn't able to do it at the time because we weren't able to find any indication or any evidence as to who this Clay Bertrand was, and we couldn't pursue it any further in that direction. The way that Garrison is apparently going to tie this whole thing in with Shaw, as you probably know, relates to the testimony of this Perry Russo, who testified before the preliminary hearing that he'd been in a party, Perry's apartment, and that Shaw and Oswald and Perry had sat there toward the end part of this party and plotted the assassination of the president. I don't know how many of you have seen the article that James Phelan has written in the Saturday Evening Post on the last issue, the issue before last. There's a story in the LA Times about him too. I talked to Mr. Phelan after the article came out. He lives down in Long Beach, and he has sent me. He says, I haven't received them yet, but he's going to send me copies of these two memoranda that he talks about in the article, and which were mentioned in the story in the LA Times. If Phelan's story is true, and it is based entirely, he says, on two memos that Garrison gave to Phelan when Phelan was talking to him over in Las Vegas shortly after this whole thing broke. Garrison came over to Las Vegas. And that I know is true because I know a couple of other people that talked to him at the time. Phelan said he talked to Garrison over in Las Vegas for some time about this, and late one evening, Garrison gave him these two memos that had been prepared by Mou Chambra, I think his name is pronounced, spelled S-C-I-A-M-B-R-A, an assistant district attorney, one of Garrison's assistants, who just recently graduated from law school a year ago. These two memos reflected, first was a memo reflecting a conversation that Chambra had with Russo over in Baton Rouge, where Russo lives. And in this memorandum, Chambra states that Russo had seen Clay Shaw on two occasions, to his knowledge. One was at a parade of some sort. I think it was a parade when Kennedy was there at one time, some years back. And another time he saw him driving the car down the street. There's no indication in Chambra's first memorandum that Russo had ever seen Oswald, had ever seen Ferry, or had ever seen Shaw in their presence. Now, the second document that Phelan has and has promised to provide me copies of is a transcript of a session that Russo had with Garrison and with Chambra and Dr. Fatter, who was a hypnotist apparently. And they had Russo come in and put him under hypnosis. And they first asked him whether he'd ever. They asked him. Well, they structured a situation. First, they placed him. Fatter said, "I want you to visualize this television screen in which you are in David Ferry's apartment. And there's a tall, white-haired man there, and they're discussing something important." And there was still no reaction on Russo's part. Then Fatter said, while Russo was under hypnosis, "I want you to visualize a meeting with Clay Shaw, Lee Harvey Oswald, and David Ferry, and they're discussing something very important." And then Russo came forth with the story about how he had been in Ferry's apartment and seen these people, and they were discussing the possibility of assassinating the president. Now, Phelan told me that he went back down to New Orleans after this. He made copies of the memos he got. Garrison let him keep him overnight, and Phelan got up early the next morning and made copies of these memos. He said Garrison had not restricted him in any way as to their use. And he went back down to New Orleans. Phelan went back down to New Orleans, went out to Garrison's house one night, and discussed this problem with Garrison. Garrison said that he was not aware of the fact that Chambray hadn't mentioned this meeting in the first memoranda. But he said, and Phelan said he had the distinct impression that Garrison had in fact never read the first memoranda. But Garrison said, look, we'll get Chambray out here now. And they did. They called him. He came out to Garrison's home. And Garrison asked him about it. And Chambray said, well, look, he said, Rousseau did mention this the first time I talked to him, but I was so busy doing a lot of other things that I just didn't mention it in this 3,500-word memoranda that he wrote. And Mr. Phelan said to him, he said, you remind me of the story of the fellow who went out for a walk and came home and wrote a little memorandum about what he found that day. And when the fellow was out walking, he found 2 cigarette butts and an empty gum wrapper and the Star of India. And he came back and he wrote a memorandum about what he found that day, and he mentioned the 2 cigarette butts and the empty gum wrapper, but he failed to mention the Star of India. And that is a sort of an apt analogy, because it seems fairly clear that if in fact, Rousseau had mentioned this in the first interview that Chambray had with him, that it would be reasonable to expect that Mr. Chambray would have mentioned it in the memorandum that he wrote. But he didn't. Now, I noticed by today's paper that Mr. Garrison has asked Mr. Phelan to come down and testify before the grand jury about this whole thing. Phelan is not here now. He's gone back to Washington. He's been working on another assignment. He'll be back there for 5 weeks or so. I have no idea what he's going to do. But Phelan's attitude toward this whole thing is very critical. And he said that this is all the evidence that Garrison has got, and he thinks that he doesn't know of anymore. That Garrison is going to be in serious trouble trying to relate this whole thing to Oswald when the case comes to trial. Which, at this point, the best guess, I guess, is that he should do it within 5 or 6 months. One of the problems that I've always had is, and this is, in Phelan's story, is consistent with Rousseau's prior statements, prior public statements, because he had a television interview with some reporters before he had this hypnosis session with Fatter and Chambray. And he said that he had never seen Lee Harvey Oswald and didn't know anything about him. But then after the hypnosis, he came forth with this story in which they saw him at this meeting. One of the things that's always made me somewhat suspicious of the whole thing is it is unlikely. I know that I would not, and I think most people that I know well at all would not, stand idly by and say nothing if they, during the course of this investigation that has been conducted by the commission, it may be that they might be reticent if they had, for other reasons, I don't know, to talk to the FBI. That depends on one's own background, I suppose. Some people are afraid to talk to the FBI. I suppose some people are rightly afraid to talk to the FBI. I don't know if there's anything in Rousseau's background to make him have to, that would, give him this anxiety. But I don't, and you'll forgive a certain amount of personal involvement perhaps at this point, but I can't imagine why he would have been afraid to talk to the commission, because the commission imposed no sanctions on any witnesses that appeared before, and there was never any story, as far as I know at that point. Nobody ever suggested when they testified before the commission, with one possible exception, that they'd been, intimidated or spoken to or dealt with in any way about their testimony. I can't understand why a guy would sit there, having knowledge of a meeting like this, and say nothing about it. And those 3 years after the event. There are a couple of other aspects. At some point, Garrison is going to have to attempt to tie this whole thing in with the events in Dallas on the 22nd. There are two problems with that. One of which relates to the actual physical evidence of what occurred at the time of the assassination, which is not conclusive by any means on the question of whether or not there might have been somebody else involved in the conspiracy at some point to assassinate the president. I say it's not conclusive by any means because it's perfectly possible that the other conspirators, if they were present there at the time, with Oswald or acting independently if they were somewhere else in Dallas except at Dealey Plaza, or if they were at Dealey Plaza, that their attempt, if they were actually going to make one, to join Oswald in the assassination, might have been abortive. If there was any such attempt, it seems clear to me that it was abortive, because the physical evidence relating to the direction of the shots, the impact of the shots on the president, is, as far as I'm concerned, conclusive, absolutely conclusive that the shots came from behind, and that that no shots struck the president from any other direction. Actually, once again, shots might have been fired from some other direction, except nobody saw them, but it's perfectly clear that no shots struck the president from any direction except from behind. That's the first problem the theorist is going to face in this connection. The second is simply to tie Ferry or Shaw, if he's going to hang the hat on Ferry and Shaw, to get them in Dallas, or relate them somehow to the events of Dallas, at least at some point. And there are, as far as I can see at this point, there are a couple of ways in which that might be done. The first relates to Ferry's activities at the time of after the assassination. On the afternoon of the 22nd, Ferry and two friends drove from New Orleans to Houston, Texas, in Ferry's station wagon. And they went to a skating rink, and they stayed overnight at a motel in Houston. Ferry told the FBI that he had just finished working he was working as a private investigator for a lawyer by the name of Gill, C. Ray Gill, who was trying an immigration case involving the father of Marcello. And that trial, which had gone on for 18 days, ended on the 22nd. And after the trial was over, Ferry said that he wanted to get away, get out of New Orleans, and he had been interested involved with the assassination. So, of course, everybody's looking for Ferry. He came back to New Orleans. He didn't turn himself over to the authorities immediately, but he went over to Southwestern Louisiana State College or something like that, which is across the lake from New Orleans somewhere, and stayed there that night with a friend of his. Came back either the next day or the day after that and turned himself over to the New Orleans police. And he was then interviewed by the FBI while he was in the custody of the New Orleans Police Department. And I think that was, I don't remember the exact date, that was within 3 or 4 days after the assassination. And he was also interviewed at that time by Garrison's office, by the New Orleans Police Department, and twice by the FBI, and the FBI also got an affidavit from him subsequent to that. And the FBI ran down the possibility that he might have known Oswald while they were both in the Civil Air Patrol, which Oswald apparently was for a short period of time. And that didn't turn out. And the Bureau, of course, questioned the other two fellows that went with him, and a lot of other people that knew Ferry, and tried to check this thing out. Now, one thing that fascinates me about all that, and I can sort of see there are two things. I can sort of see what's coming, or what's likely to develop. I understand that Mr. Lane made a statement the other day that the New Orleans developments would have a very shattering effect on the country. And he may have been more specific than that. I don't know exactly what it is, but I think, at least if I were handling the investigation on the other side, I would be very curious about two facts. One, Ferry went to Guatemala twice during the month of October 1963. Now, he said that the reason he went to Guatemala is because the case he was working on involving this fellow Marcello, apparently Marcello was from Guatemala, and he had to go down to Guatemala to conduct some investigation relating to the possibility that Marcello had forged a birth certificate, apparently in an attempt to avoid immigration problems. But that's fascinating, of course, that Ferry was in Guatemala at this time, because Guatemala, as we all know, was the training ground for most of the anti-Castro Cubans that were involved in the Bay of Pigs and a lot of CIA activity in Guatemala. I guess all that's fascinating. Ferry, at some time prior to, I can't remember the exact date, but I think it was his involvement with this group terminated by January 1962, which is almost 2 years prior to the time of the assassination. He was involved in an anti-Castro group in New Orleans called the, I think it was either the DRE or the CRE, Student Revolutionary Council or something like that. It was an anti-Castro group. And there have been rumors about for some time that at some point during its existence, this organization had been receiving finances from the Central Intelligence Agency, which in a sense wouldn't really surprise me very much, because New Orleans at that time had a lot of anti-Castro Cubans and a lot of people who had come from Cuba. And the CIA was quite frankly involved in the program trying to recruit people to get involved in the anti-Castro movement. And I don't know of anything that would indicate that the CIA ever had given any money to this organization. It's fairly clear that they weren't giving any money to it at the time that after the Bay of Pigs, or even prior to that, because the organization eventually got kicked out of an office that it had at 544 Camp Street in New Orleans because it didn't pay its rent. And the thing finally sort of just disintegrated. And one of the guys that was involved in it was a fellow named Sergio Arcacha Smith, who's also in the news in connection with this thing. He's been over in Dallas, and Garrison wants to get him to come back to New Orleans to testify about something, which is another indication that this is one of the ways in which Garrison is trying to move. Another possible, and in connection with Ferry's trip to Galveston and Houston, it is also a fact that a fellow named Breck Wall, who was a friend of Jack Ruby's, went to Galveston that weekend. And it's also a fact that there was a telephone conversation between Wall and Ruby while Wall was in Galveston. Ruby testified that he called Wall because he wanted to discuss with him some problems he's been having with the American Artist Guild or some variety guild or something like that, because they were giving him a hard time because of his amateur night. They thought these strippers that he had really weren't amateurs, and they were getting after him because he was breaking the TV union requirements by having amateurs in his strippers in his place. And he wanted to discuss this with Wall, who apparently was connected with this organization, which Garrison suggests doesn't fit in with the rest of Ruby's set that weekend. You know, he was terribly concerned about the assassination. He closed his place, and he was going around all upset about it and taking pictures of signs, you know, that said the feature or war and that kind of thing. And he couldn't figure out why Ruby would call Wall to talk to him about this. Well, Garrison, I think, was going to try to relate these two events to each other. And in fact, he has said that it's clear to him, on the basis of the fact that there was a telephone at the skating rink, that the skating rink was a message center of some sort. And then that Ferry went around and introduced himself to everybody at the skating rink, talked to everybody at the skating rink. But that's absurd in its face, because this is a message center of some sort. I suppose that Ferry would stand next to the telephone and answer the telephone number, and I would doubt very seriously to be going around telling everybody I'm David Ferry. And what the message center was, so there was a telephone. There's telephones all over, you know. I've never known to figure out exactly what the point of all that is, but I have some information that he's going to be heading in that direction. Another possibility relates to the testimony of a woman in Dallas by the name of Sylvia Odio, who said that someone who was introduced to her as Leon Oswald, and that's what Russo said he knew Oswald as, I guess, at this meeting, came to her apartment with two Mexican types or Cuban types late in September of 1963. She knew it was late September because she moved out of the apartment prior to the 1st of October. And she was getting ready to move when these guys came. They came about 9 o'clock one night, and she was quite sure it was September 26th, but it could have been the day before, she said. Well, if these people came on September 26th, it couldn't have been Oswald, because Oswald was in Mexico at that point. But, you know, so maybe she's wrong about the 26th, or could it have been the 25th? Well, she was not able to identify the other two men. They came there and wanted her to translate a a letter from Spanish into English, and they're attempting to raise funds for the anti-Castro movement. Mrs. Odio is a very high-born, aristocratic Cuban woman whose father was, prior to the Castro Revolution, was a very wealthy man, owned most of the transport facilities in Havana, apparently. And at this time, in 1964, was a political prisoner at Castro's on the Isle of Pines. Mrs. Odio, once again, you know, it would be nice if you get bishops for witnesses. Although, if you look forward to some of our outstanding bishops, I'm not all sure that would be particularly helpful. But Mrs. Odio had an interesting background. She left Miami. She had been married to a fellow, I guess, in Miami, or in Cuba. She left Cuba. They went to Puerto Rico. Her husband left her, went to Europe. Back to Puerto Rico. She came. She got 5 or 6 children. She's 26 years old. She came to Miami, and she's got and her family itself. She's got about 8 or 9 brothers and sisters, and they were all just penniless. I mean, there they were. Everything they'd lost everything in the revolution, and she was working behind the jewelry counter at Neiman Marcus's, and I don't think it really set too well with her because she wasn't used to this kind of thing, and she. I don't know, I sometimes wondered if and she also had, as developed by the FBI, and she readily testified, she also had certain psychological problems, which I don't blame her. I mean, I expect most of us would in circumstances like that. But one of her problems was that she was subjected to seizures, something called grand mal seizures. And she was struck with one of them, as a matter of fact, at the time. She first saw Oswald's picture on the television after the assassination because she said she recognized him as the guy that was in her apartment. And no question about it, she did faint. And at that time at work, she was hauled off to the hospital and was unconscious in this condition for 2 or 3 hours. It's something like an epileptic seizure, I guess, but it's not quite the same. You're unconscious or out of contact. Unconscious, I guess, for a long period of time. Now, in order to try to determine whether Oswald could have been there, because she couldn't identify these other 2 men, the commission tried to pinpoint his precise movements throughout that period of time. On September 23rd, Marina and Ruth Payne left New Orleans and drove to Irving, Texas, along with Oswald's kid. We were able to pinpoint the fact that Oswald had to have stayed in New Orleans until, at the very latest, 8 a.m. on September 25th. And I'm always, even though, the commission didn't do a perfect job, there are certain bits of inspiration that I think are very lawyer-like, and I think this investigation was a very lawyer-like piece of work. Because he had cashed an unemployment compensation check in New Orleans at a particular supermarket. And I suppose the course of action here is obvious. We went back to the Texas State Unemployment Bureau compensation check. And we were able to determine when that check had been sent from Austin and trace its movement through the ordinary course of the movement of the mail. this investigation was a very lawyer-like piece of work, because he had cashed an unemployment compensation check in New Orleans at a particular supermarket. And I suppose the course of action here is obvious. You go back, we went back to it was the Texas State Unemployment Bureau compensation check. And we were able to determine when that check had been sent from Austin and trace its movement through the ordinary course of moving the mail to the post office, the substation where Oswald had his post office box. Couldn't have arrived there prior to 5 a.m. on the 25th, and it wouldn't have been distributed at any time prior to 8 a.m. Well, he could have got it at 5 a.m., I'm sorry, but he couldn't have cashed it until after 8 a.m. because the supermarket didn't open until 8 o'clock. And the initials of the person in the supermarket who had authorized the cashing of this check indicated that this person had worked from 8 a.m. till 12 noon on the 25th of September. So Oswald had to have cashed the check sometime between 8 a.m. and 12 noon on the 25th. So giving him as much time as possible, supposing he did it at 8 o'clock. He could then have left New Orleans. He crossed the border into Laredo, according to the Mexican immigration records. It's approximately 2 p.m. on the 26th. So we've got to find, and we have no indication of where he was from 8 a.m. on the 25th to 2 p.m. on the 26th. Now, he could not have gone by bus, and we know that he crossed the border in Mexico on the bus, and he went to Mexico City on the bus, and he came back from Mexico on the bus. We know that he called a person by the name of Horace Twyford in Houston and said that he wanted to talk to him, which suggested to us, not unreasonably, I think, that he planned to be in Houston, where he would not have been if he'd gone to Dallas. He could not have gone by bus from New Orleans to Dallas and back to Laredo at the time that he had. He could have driven from New Orleans to Dallas and then caught a bus down. And the interesting part of it is that if he'd taken the bus on the night of the 25th from Dallas, he would have changed buses in a place called Alice, Texas, and gotten on a bus from Houston that would have been the same bus that he would have been on if he'd come directly from New Orleans. And he was on that bus. So that in this sense, the things sort of tied together. There were no bus tickets sold, however, from Dallas to Laredo during this period of time when Oswald had a lot of tickets. And there was a ticket sold, there were 4 tickets sold that day from Houston to Laredo. And a guy at the bus, people thought that Oswald could have been one of the guys who bought one of the tickets, but he was very shaky and was really couldn't really rely on that testimony very much. One of the things that fascinated me about Oswald's movements was his landlord said that he left the apartment, or that the landlord didn't see him anymore, and the landlord was looking for him because Oswald hadn't paid his rent and didn't. That Oswald was not around the apartment after the evening of the 24th. One of the things that I was never able quite to understand, and the landlord said he saw one of the neighbors said he saw Oswald get on a streetcar or a bus in New Orleans on the afternoon of the 24th with a bag and suitcase in his hand, 2 of them, which he apparently took to Mexico and then brought back to Dallas. Well, Oswald's post office substation was in downtown New Orleans, and that's where he picked up the check. Couldn't have gotten the check before 5 a.m. on the morning of the 25th. There was a place within 3 blocks of the post office where he had previously cashed checks from the place he'd worked, and also some unemployment checks. But he didn't cash the check there. He went 3 miles through New Orleans back to a supermarket near his apartment to cash the check. And when you sit back and speculate, and this is all you can do, you've got a few hard pieces of evidence. We know where he cashed the check, we know where he got it. It's hard to really figure how credible the testimony that he left the apartment on the 24th was, but all right, let's assume for the moment that it's true. Why did he go all the way back to the supermarket near his house to cash the check rather than cashing it within 3 blocks of the place he picked it up? And then apparently, if the theory that the commission finally adopted was that he did essentially leave from New Orleans in the bus and go to Houston and then down to Laredo, then go all the way back downtown to New Orleans to catch the bus and leave. I've never really understand that. And I don't know if there's any explanation for it. Maybe just an irrational kind of thing, but I don't know why he did it. We checked out all of the inexpensive hotels in downtown New Orleans. This is one thing the FBI really loved the commission by the time we got through, because the FBI never conducted an investigation like this one. I mean, we had agents out there beating themselves up and down the streets of downtown New Orleans for about a week, checking out every flop house in New Orleans to find out whether Oswald or anybody with a name that was similar to his had checked into a hotel and stayed in downtown New Orleans on the night of the 24th, which we thought that he might do if the testimony, and this was all based on the very shaky testimony of his neighbor that he'd seen him leave on the afternoon of the 24th. Well, we weren't able to find that. Didn't produce anything either. Some people testified that they had seen him on the bus, and they talked to him and told him that he'd come. And they assumed that he'd come from New Orleans on the bus. He didn't tell them that. Marina testified that he'd gone by bus all the way. And that's the only evidence that he did that. Now, it would obviously have been nice if we could have found anybody, any other contacts that Oswald had with anybody that might have driven him to Dallas. But that was something we were never able to find. I'll close up this sort of rambling discourse on the evidence in connection with this whole thing by saying one thing. It shows two things, I guess, at least. When it became clear that we were not going to be able to resolve Silvio's testimony ourselves, it was just there. He could have been there. He could have if he had time. We wrote a letter to the FBI asking the FBI to find the three people that had been in Mrs. Silvio's apartment. And that's the old bureaucratic game, I suppose, putting the monkey on somebody else's back. Because I would not have wanted to have accepted the responsibility of not having tried to find these other three people who were going to conclude that it wasn't Oswald. It was pretty clear to me, in fact, it was a very tongue-in-cheek letter, okay, boys, so you're going to do with this one. Well, we went ahead and concluded on the basis of the probabilities that Oswald was not in her apartment because we couldn't connect up her evidence or testimony up with anybody else. And I had the impression myself throughout this entire period, for what I thought was pretty good reason, which is something that one of those things that can never be really reflected in the record. Maybe I should have followed this in a different way. But I had the impression that Mrs. Odia wanted to get information from me that would help her involve Oswald with these other people, with these pro-Castro Cubans, because she thought these were really pro-Castro Cubans. I had the feeling that she really wanted to involve Oswald with the pro-Castros, which would, of course, have been to her, advantage if she could have involved the pro-Castros in the assassination. She was very curious about Oswald's movements and wanted to sort of get information from the conversation that we had after her testimony that would help her corroborate her story. She still believes that Oswald was in her apartment. We wrote the letter to the FBI. We drafted the section of the report dealing with Mrs. Odia and Oswald's presence, and it's in about the middle of Chapter 6 of the report. And it was the night of the 20th or 21st of September of 1964 when we were going over the page proofs of this section of the report for the last time. It was going back to the government printing office, and that was going to be it. And a courier from the FBI came in with a letter from Mr. Hoover indicating that the FBI had found the three men that were in Mrs. Odia's apartment. There I am. Marvelous. What am I going to do with this section of the report that's locked into page proofs? The footnotes are in there, the pages are in there. If we change the page numbers, it's going to follow every footnote in the whole report. And so I went down to Mr. Rankin's building store. I said, what are we going to do, Mr. Rankin? Mr. Rankin, a very proper governmental response, said, that's not the right question, Mr. Liebeler. The question is, what are you going to do? So we decided, well, we were going to have to rewrite that section of the report. There was no question about that. He agreed. And it had to be done by 12 o'clock that night. He said, the proofs had to be back over printing. The report had to be delivered to the president the next day. Well, overriding policy reasons. And so I sat down and rewrote the whole section and used the same number of footnotes and the same number of pages approximately. It was a little bit longer than the other one, and went over basically on yellow scratch pad like this in my handwriting, which is not very clear, to go into final in the printing office. And indicating that the FBI had found these three guys. They found one of them in Johnsondale, California. And all I had at that point was a letter from the FBI that said they'd found them, and they were going to send their reports later. They were going to follow up with their actual reports. Well, imagine my surprise when I got a copy. And this is one thing I'll say about Mr. Lane. He was right about this. I got a copy of the publisher's proof of Lane's book when I was up in Vermont last summer. And I started to read through it, and I got to this section on Silvio Odio. And he said that the FBI had finally developed, in pursuing its investigation, the FBI had developed evidence to show that these three men could not possibly have been in the Civilians Department because they had finally found work records. These guys had checked in, through time clocks in Miami. They'd been working in Miami that day, two of them. They went back and re-interviewed this first guy that came up with the story, and he changed his story, and the whole thing just collapsed. These three guys, even though they thought, this one guy said that he'd been in the Civilians Department at some point during this period of time, these three couldn't have been there at that time. And the really ironic part of it was that the Miami Bureau, the Miami office of the Bureau had developed that information on the day before we got the letter from the FBI saying that these three men were the three guys that were in Silvio's apartment, so that the field office of the Bureau had already developed information showing that this couldn't possibly have happened while we were sitting there rewriting a report to indicate that these were the three guys that were there. So I would suppose that one possibility that Garrison might try to follow up on is to indicate that if some of these fellows that were with Oswald, these Mexicans or Cubans that appear throughout this story in New Orleans, were in fact with Oswald, they did in fact take him to New Orleans in the car that day, and then after and probably the purpose was, at least I would argue, the purpose would be to infiltrate Oswald into the anti-Castro movement to try to get him into Cuba, which is what, and this is somewhat attractive, as a matter of fact, in some ways, because Oswald was trying to get to Cuba. That's what he did. He went to Mexico City to try to get into Cuba, and it may be, it's possible, I suppose, that he did go to Dallas and talk to Odio with the purpose of trying to infiltrate himself into that organization, because people thought that she was very influential in the anti-Castro movement to get to Cuba. Then after that was unsuccessful, Oswald just took the left down to Laredo. I have not really seen in Garrison's story, and the stories going on in New Orleans, very much that would lead me to believe that he has anything very substantial. But there is an area here in which obviously the FBI and the Commission at the time were not able to tie down all the stories and to follow up all aspects of things. Primarily, I think, because we weren't able to establish the identity or even the existence of Clay Bertrand. I've been told since then that the Bureau has interested themselves in this to some extent after Garrison started, and they do not think that Shaw is Bertrand. But that's just hearsay. I have no idea what they've done.
Okay, I think we'll break up the formal part. Perry, Andrews, and Bertrand, originally investigated by the FBI and the Warren Commission, how did they get their names involved at all?
Well, I've indicated where they got Ferry's name. This fellow came and reported.
Said that he was...
Yeah. Andrews told his story to. He was a friend of John Rice, who was the head of the Secret Service in New Orleans at that time. He came to Rice and told him that Bertrand had called him about Oswald and Oswald from his office, and Andrews went from there. And those were the only two.
And Bertrand, how did they...
Andrews mentioned his name.
Okay.
Andrews mentioned his name. Yeah.
There's a girl who works on this campus in the library who told me that she was working in the New Orleans library the day of the assassination. And that evening the FBI came there and they went through, and apparently Oswald used the library quite frequently.
Yeah.
And they went through the records there and found the books that he'd been checking out.
That's right.
And in these books, she says, and she may be lying, but she says they found anti-Castro statements in these books. Her reaction was that if there's any record of that in the one.
Well, the list of books that Oswald checked out in New Orleans libraries influenced his lives, I'm pretty sure.
So, I mean, is there any record of the anti-Castro statements being in?
You mean it's written into the books or anti-Castro books?
What?
You mean anti-Castro books? Or
no, in the books, so on all kinds of subjects were these anti-Castro statements, she said.
I've never heard that. And I don't know whether the Bureau went through the books, to look at them, or if they just got a list. I really don't know the answer
She
to that.
said, well, this is what she says, that they went through them and she was there until midnight that night.
I wouldn't be surprised if they did go through them, but there's no indication in the reports that I recall that there were any such statements in the books. I expect the books are still there. The FBI reports are on that. Yeah.
Well, one thing that I found kind of interesting was that you said when Barry came back from Texas and he knew that the authorities in New Orleans wanted him, and he spent the night before he surrendered himself in a university studio. That doesn't make much sense. Why would he surrender himself right away? And why would he
I don't know.
go there?
I don't know. He had a friend over there. He went over there. I don't know, maybe to talk to him about it. I don't recall if he indicated the Bureau why he didn't turn himself over right away.
Who did he know there? Was there any connection between him and his friends or anything that could be developed?
I don't remember whether the Bureau checked him out or not, because I don't remember that. I don't remember the name of the guy, and I've never run it down. The name is in the FBI reports. The name of this guy is very expensive at this time. What the Bureau did with him, I don't know. I'm sure they verified it very clearly, but whether they pursued it or not, I don't know. Once again, I would imagine that they did, but I don't know if they did or not.
How much information is still classified in the archives? Every day we hear it's not much, but it keeps, every time Senator Garrison finds an awful lot of it he can't get his hands on. Do you have any idea exactly how much it is?
Well, 2/3 of the agency reports, the FBI reports, and CIA and Secret Service, have been made available, and 1/3 of them have still been withheld. There's still the problem with the commission documents themselves, the commission papers, the memoranda, the correspondence files, drafts, transcripts of testimony. Much less of that has been made available. And that is, as I've indicated before, is an inexcusable situation that should never have happened. The commission decided fairly early in the game that one of the lawyers and the staff, and one of the lawyers was assigned this job of making a determination of which of the commission papers should be released at the time to release the report. And that was never done. The commission disbanded, the lawyers left, and all the commission papers were turned over to the archives. And that question was finally raised by people who were interested in going through them, raising the archives. The archives kept pestering Lee Rankin about them over a considerable period of time. He was general counsel of the commission. Rankin wouldn't do anything about it. And I finally got interested in it last summer, and I called Rankin, and Rankin just wouldn't do anything about it. His position was, the commission is disbanded. I'm not general counsel for anything anymore. I'm not going to do anything about it, period. And as a result of this, the chief archivist spoke to the chief justice in the summer of '66, last summer. And well, the substance of that conversation has never been reported to me. Immediately thereafter, the archives went to the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department and got an opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel that it was their responsibility, the archives, to determine which of these papers should be released and which shouldn't. And they immediately embarked upon a review of these papers with a view toward releasing them. And I may say that that's just absurd, because they'll be lucky if they get those papers reviewed by the time the next president is assassinated with everything going. We got one guy working on it.
What do these papers constitute?
Pardon?
I don't understand. Are these just the running transcriptions of what the witnesses actually
Well, it
said?
includes that, but that's a problem, and I've indicated to the archives. In fact, this whole problem got to the point where at Christmas time I was in Washington and I told Congressman Ford about it, and told him, and he had been generally aware that the situation at the archives was next to hopeless, and I confirmed this. He said, well, what should we do about it? So I suggested to him, I wrote him a memorandum, as a matter of fact, about it, in which I suggested that we set up something that I would say, well, let's call it an advisory committee to the Administrator of General Services, who's in charge of the archives. And let's just get you and probably Senator Cooper and probably Senator Russell, anybody that would be interested. He said he would talk to Russell and Cooper about it, and Boggs, and I was going to talk to Dulles about it. And we'd get 2 or 3 staff members on it, and we would either get some people from the Justice Department in there, or get some guys from the staff down there that really, in a sense, this is almost a political determination. that the archives are totally unsuited to make. And in any event, an archivist, bless their hearts, if they're going to make a determination to withhold or to release, you can bet your bottom dollar that the determination will always be weighted in favor of withholding, because they're not going to put their necks on the line and release something that would embarrass somebody, because they're not political people. They don't, they're very nervous about this kind of thing. Well, I wrote them around to Ford, and nothing ever came, but I subsequently learned through the invariable grapevine that he'd sent them around to Rankin and asked Rankin for his views on it. Rankin had showed it to Professor Redlick at NYU Law School, and Mr. Redlick had given Mr. Rankin his views. And while I don't know what the views were, I don't have any real doubt as to what they were. And that story came back to me from somebody that Redlick had told it to, and nothing was ever done about it. But I've indicated to the archives that what they ought to look at first are the correspondence and memoranda that the commission prepared, because the transcripts, the testimony are really, that's marginal, because over 99% of that, much more than that, is printed in 26 volumes. There's only a few deletions that haven't been printed. That's, the big thing that Lane makes that point about is the Jackie Kennedy's, reference to wounds deleted, and he wants to know why that was deleted. Ford has a complete set of these himself, and he's